Okay, great. So you already know who I am, but I've been at Pixar since 2000. I started first working on Monsters, Inc. When they needed people staffed up in their lighting department, and then continued to work on pretty much every film after that for a number of years, like Finding Nemo and Incredibles, Cars, and then what happens over time there is like you start to take on slightly larger roles, and then maybe you have to skip ahead a film, and then a slightly larger role from that, and skip ahead 2 films, and now like I'm in this sad state where I like work on a movie once every 5 years because you skip so far ahead that it's unfortunate that like I don't get the joy of working on some of them, but then the plus side is I get to watch them like you with fresh eyes as an audience member, right? And so it's cool. And so every now and then I try to jump in, like my friend is the DP on Toy Story 4, and so help him get some things going and get connected to another show. And then as mine spins back up, like now we're in full-on mode in Incredibles 2, and so we'll be pretty focused on that for the next few years. So my background is I was always interested in film, always just into movies and making like little stop motion films as a kid. And so I went to college and had no idea what I wanted to do, and like got into 3D kind of accidentally. There was a program called True Space by like an Italian company. You're nodding your head. What were they called? Caligari, something like that. That's it, yeah. And we had no money, and my college roommate like thought it was like one of those drive doubling programs, and so we downloaded it. And we're like, this isn't it at all, right? But then we got poking at it and got really into it and started like blowing all our classes, like making these little animations and things like that. And so then I saw Bug's Life that these guys made, and it suddenly clicked. It suddenly dawned on me. It's like, you know what? People actually do this for a living, and maybe I should think about doing that because I'm not doing anything else. And so I went to art school, came out to San Francisco. Did that for a couple of years, and then found myself over at Pixar. They really liked hiring 22-year-olds at that time because I would work for donuts, and I was quite happy. What we do is not new, right? Like it's all visual storytelling, and Pixar has kind of institutionalized it and does it on this big scale and quite successfully. But like we didn't really invent any of these techniques, right? Like Caravaggio here in the Calling of St. Matthew, did this in the 15th century, and this is actually, it's one of my favorite paintings, and you can't see it very well up there with that light, but it's wonderful because it's everything we do encapsulated in a single frame, right? There's a story being told here in this that you need no words, you need no dialogue, and you understand, right? Everything that's happening, and he's pointing across the room, and this guy's pointing at him, being like, "What? This guy's a jerk. You want him?" And the light is coming in and shaping it, and like everything that we try to get across in our storytelling, like is happening here. And like I've never been a religious guy at all, but like I find this really, really moving, right? It's a really powerful piece of storytelling, and it's pretty wonderful. So whenever I'm looking for inspiration, I go back to this stuff, and Caravaggio in particular, because he was kind of awesome. He was like a drunken lout, right? Like he would take his money that he got from these and go and blow it on a bunch of booze and get in fights. He killed men and like had to escape to southern Italy and all that. And it's like I went to art school and I thought we were the nerds, right? But like they were pretty tough back then. And so these guys are great. They're full of inspiration, and so I use them a lot. And then jumping ahead a number of hundred years, there's the master filmmakers of the mid 20th century, right? Like Robert Burke combined with Alfred Hitchcock is just like genius, right? Because it does the same thing, right? Like much like the Calling St. Matthew, like these frames, they tell a story like without needing any words at all. And I'm a firm believer that like the best movies in the world you can watch on mute and you understand everything that's going on, right? And the dialogue is window dressing, and that's great. And I love Quentin Tarantino, and that's a fun theatrical bit of dialogue. But you can get it just from the framing, just from the compositions. So we draw a lot from that. We do a lot of research, kind of like Nate was describing earlier. We find like all sorts of different ways to pull in different elements into our storytelling, into like what's the visual language of our worlds. Like some of my favorite films are good inspiration, right? There's Shawshank Redemption is a really good example of using color to tell a story. They do this really cool thing where it's a little bit of a stereotype, frankly, to do this sort of cool light in prison and warm light outside of prison, right? And you see it, and it's done successfully in a lot of films, and it works, right? But like something cool that they do here is like, even if they're in prison or out of prison, it's whatever their state of mind is, right? If they're in the prison of their mind, they shoot under this very cool flat light, like in the first, like the upper and the left-hand painting photo, and then the lower right one, like guy actually got out of prison, but he couldn't get over it, right? And so he was still stuck in prison mentally, even though he had actually been paroled and he was out. And so it's an interesting bit of storytelling because you're actually connecting at a deeper level rather than at the superficial level with the characters, and you can follow these through lines all the way to the end of the movie, right? And so you got him when he's out in the lower left frame there, right? And he's also out in his mind, so it's shot in this beautiful warm light. But in the beer drinking sequence on top of the prison building that they were tarring, right? They had this kind of moment of freedom, right? And they're still firmly in this horrible, horrible, oppressive jail, right? But it's their state of mind, and so it's a nice bit of using color as a visual storytelling element. So we try to do that a lot, and I think one of our most successful examples of that was in Up. I didn't work on this movie, and so I feel very safe saying that this is probably my favorite piece of filmmaking we've ever done. Right? There's the Act 1 bit of this with that long montage of their life together and everything that happens. And like I don't know if you were completely aware of it or hopefully just subconsciously aware of it when you're watching it, but Ellie's color is pink, right? And every time she's in frame, some element associated with her is pink. And so that's consistent all the way through. And so so knowing that, I want to play that sequence for you, or a bit of that sequence, and then just kind of pay attention to where the pink in the frame is. It's not always necessarily in the color, right? Like a direct color on a surface. Like a lot of times we'll do it in the atmosphere or in the haze, but there will be some consistent production design of the pink all the way through there. Just to keep a subtle reminder, because it matters, right? Like what happens is like we have all this at the end, and this is very kind of touching, moving moment, and they never kind of fulfill their dreams, and you all know what happens. I'll just let this play out. But you notice the color of the light in the room, and then the color reflected in the window. And this is actually why it's my favorite thing that Pixar has done as far as like using color in visual storytelling, because like you may see it in the movie because tears, but between the first frame and the last frame of this, like the reflection in the window, right? Like Ellie goes away, right? And she's gone, and there's the Act 1 break, and then we go into the comedy portion of the movie, right? And it's like, that's just genius filmmaking, right? And like props to those guys. And so we try to do a lot of things like that, right? Associating like color, lighting direction, lighting style with certain tones, certain thematic elements in the movie. You know, we like a lot of times when these guys get the script and they're boarding it out, right? And trying to find a lot of like the shape language of the movie and all that, we're trying to build a color script, right? As we go, hanging the same sort of kind of emotional notes on the bones of the script, the way they are, and we meet in the middle there with the finished footage. So a lot of times what we're doing is more functional, right? Like directing the eye around. You know, there's a lot of scenes, especially in WALL-E, where it's just like without some careful use of lighting, like you'd have no idea what to look at, right? You know, we've got like a lot of trash everywhere and a robot who's more or less made out of trash at this point after a few hundred years, right? He's kind of rusty and all beat up. And so we kind of carefully carve things out from the scene. And this works across cuts, right? And we have to like lead the eye from place to place and make sure the audience is seeing the right thing. For mood as well, right? You know, the difference between that and that is a very different feeling about that dog, right? Like, it's like that's a bad dog. But we also, you know, like forests are notoriously hard and busy because there's a lot of complicated shapes. We'll try to soften the lighting back there, push some atmosphere into it, take contrast away from what we don't want you to look at, and put contrast or some sort of element to draw your attention into what we do want you to look at. Similar here at the end of Toy Story 3, where these guys are going down to their doom. This was both for structural clarity as well as for an emotional moment, right? They're just kind of deer in the headlights with all this hot incinerator light coming up in their face. And then sometimes it's a complete change in lighting, right? If you look at this, like Muntz here in his lab, he looks just kind of like a goofy old guy, right? But when we can get in there and design some lighting, right, you have a pretty different feeling about him, right? It suddenly becomes very sinister, and so it simplifies the read, it gives you the emotional tone, and it hopefully carries the scene across. So we deal with a lot of complexity, obviously, in our worlds, right? It's this is a bit in the dump in Toy Story 3. I was fortunate enough to come onto this show for a few months just to do all the way through from where they get into the dump to the incinerator, and it was a blast, right? Because it's cinematic, it's intense, it's high energy, high action, and a lot of complexity. We're moving through a lot of different spaces, and so a lot of the way we approach that is, you guys shoot mostly live action, right? Is that right? So I do as well, and I try to draw maps of everything, right? Just because communication is really key, especially when you get complexity down. And so we bring that into the CG world here as well, and we draw maps out and structure, like, where are we going to be? What's our camera plan? These are just two examples, but this can go on for pages. And just to give everybody a good sense of where they are in the world right away. So otherwise, when you just load up the shot, it can be very, very confusing. And so we try to really, really detail it out, what all the pieces are, where the lights are, when they're used in different spots, because as with all these moving parts, as I'm sure you know from your own productions, communication is key, right? And everybody needs to have some idea of what everybody else is doing, what direction they're going. So this next frame, this is an example of this same sequence and how it developed over time. And I like to include it because there's, similar to the story stuff where we make a lot of bad movies before we make the great movie, right? We do a lot of bad lighting before we make the great lighting also, right? There's this story out there that Pixar just does it and they land it and it's wonderful, right? But we spend, the magic of Pixar is we're very aware when we keep getting it wrong, right? And we'll do it wrong over and over and over again until we get it right. And you can see how this fluctuated. This is over a 2-month period where sometimes it gets better, sometimes it gets worse, sometimes it takes a big step forward, sometimes it takes a big step back. Here, I'll play that again. Because we have to find it also. We have to find what's the tone of this sequence, what's the cinematography here, how do we want to read these characters, and how do we want to arrive with them along the way. You can see Lotso had no scleras for most of this time down in the corner there, which I thought looked pretty cool and evil, but we couldn't convince Lee to do that. He had to have real eyes at the end of the day. So here's kind of a case study, taking that all the way through the process. The most recent show that I worked on was Piper, and it was a blast. We had a really good time. I'm glad you liked it too. It was a cool show. It had interesting roots in that Al Barillero was the director, and he was the Anim Soup on Brave. And after he came off that, he wanted to go into the tools department actually and work on some better animation tools and sculpting tools and how they could get more easily different shapes out of characters. And so he worked there for a while, and running along the beach was kind of inspired by these sand. It eventually sort of grew into a film with much encouragement from the studio execs, because there was something really cute in there. There was a story to tell, about what this character's journey was, and his fear of the water and all these things. It blended so well that it moved from this technical project to this really fun baby bird that we see. And so this is what we started with, right? We get these storyboards, and they're by a variety of different artists, right? So they're not consistent, they're different, but they capture the tone. They capture what we want to tell, the cuteness, the overall readability of the character. And then what we do is take that into the art department and distill it down into what does this bird mean, right? What does it look like? Like, what is the actual model that we can use here? It has the simplicity, the appeal, the range of acting possibilities that we want. And so we do a lot of that with drawing. Typically, we take it into sculpting also, because once you see things in 3D, you'll understand them a little bit differently than you did in 2D, right? And kind of where you can cheat in some of your 2D drawings, you can't in 3D space. And so we like to do that, and so we can actually put them on a turntable and spin them around and look at them from under different lighting conditions until we come up with this is the character we want to make, right? And we weren't going for quite photoreal on this guy. Like, you know, bird eyes are on the side of their head, right? And they also have like completely fully vacant, full pupil eyes, right? You can't see their iris the way their eye geometry is structured. It looked a little bit possessed, a little bit demonic, right? Which was kind of adorable, actually, right? He looked like he had murder on his mind, but like it wasn't going to work for our character, right? And so we ended up doing a little bit more traditional eye approach on there, where we brought him around the front, we gave him some irises, and it made him more expressive, right? It was the right answer to do. As much as we liked kind of some of the more naturalistic qualities, this is a good reason to go this way, because otherwise, like, you couldn't really tell when he was happy or sad or scared or being brave. And so we went with this, but we were very inspired by nature, right? We did a lot of photography. We spent a lot of time at the beach, looking at birds, looking at different parts of the set and the world, just to try to find, like, what is the magic in there? What's inspiring us? Because, you know, we don't want to completely be arbitrary and make it up, because there's something really wonderful out there that we've been seeing. And so we spent quite a bit of time, like, watching David Attenborough films and, like, taking all the best things from nature documentaries and trying to incorporate it in. But we didn't want too much unstructured detail, right? Like, particularly in the world, right? It can be a little unappealing in spots and a little bit busy. And so we had to rectify that with our very, very cute painted, designed character and figure out how we were going to make it all work together. It's one of the important things, one of the things Al kept saying is we wanted not photorealistic, but authenticity. And so we've tried to think of different ways to do that, different ways to approach it, but we wanted to make sure it was consistent across the whole world as well, right? Like, these are some early sketches we were doing to try and figure out, like, how do we make this bird blend in with the world, feel like he's part of that world, but special and stand apart from it. Like, we wanted to avoid, like, a photoreal world and cartoon characters, right? Like, there's something about bringing it all together and making it feel authentic and believable that was important to us. And we needed to make sure he, you know, could express himself and act in all the ways that, you know, you expect a Pixar character to do so. And so overall, it ended up being an illustrative style, right? Like, it was as much about simplification as anything, right? It's like in computers these days, it's really easy to add a ton of detail and, like, a lot of feathers and a lot of sand grains. And, like, the goal for us was, how do we simplify it down? How do we make a clean frame that you expect, that you feel like you could be there, you could live in that space, but isn't overpowering you with detail. And so, you know, we looked at a lot of sets and what is it about the beach that makes it feel that way, right? You know, it's like you see this sort of wet pattern on the water as it recedes back out from the sand. You see this sort of marine layer and all this atmosphere. And so, you know, we started building these things with basic building blocks. And so we had our technical geniuses come up with ways of, like, taking, like, a single modeled sand grain and making, like, a bunch of jewel-like colors and refractive qualities to it, and then we could build piles, right? And then our effects department could use that to build whole scenes, right? So, like, this shot here has, like, millions and millions and millions of sand grains in it, and they all refract light in the way that I needed it to feel like sand, right? And then became, you know, the production design on top of that. It's like, okay, well, we can get there, we can make it very realistic, and now how do we simplify it down? So we limited the amount of colors it could do. We limited how much tracing it went through, how much was glass versus how much was a diffuse quality. And so we ended up with something that reacted to light in the ways that we liked it to in all these different circumstances. And then the next trick was getting that to work with the water, of course, right? And so we had all this procedural sand, all this procedural water, and like, how are we going to get these things to connect together? And so we had this great video that was shot in Kauai of like what it looked like underwater. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out like what water would mean on this show. And we ended up thinking, the water is really a character, right? The water is actually the antagonist in the show. It's the thing that Piper has to overcome. And so we wanted the world to reflect that. And so what we ended up doing was making a very physical model of the water and then lighting it in different ways so that you could understand Piper's emotional state based on what the water was doing. So like early in the film, very placid and very smooth, and just like it's his perfect morning. It's a wonderful, wonderful day. And then like as it goes on, like it starts to get a little bit more intense, and he's got to go down and get the food. And so we've got a few more waves. We've got some shapes going on there, right? And then like he totally gets blindsided by this wave. Am I spoiling this? Have you all seen Piper? Right? Yeah. So from there on, like the water is his enemy, right? And it's really high contrast, right? And it's really scary. And so rather than like redefining what water was all the way through, we had one water model, and then we would light it differently, right? We built a model that would react to light in the ways that we wanted it to work. And so that way we could go through these 3 stages of what the water would look like without having to kind of chase our tails about what this material means. And what that is just like, you know, when we shoot, you know, you stick like big black sheets up where we need to block light, and it worked wonderfully here too, right? So you can make the water like really pitted and really contrasted, so you just get the sun searing through it by sticking these big dark cards in the sky. You know, fortunately we don't need ladders, right? So we can make these things like 30 stories tall. But it gave the tone of the water that we wanted to, and that way we could art direct it shot by shot. So then once we had our world, we had our character, we had our sets, we have our water, like our broad visual goals for the show, we wanted, again, to be inspired by nature, but pick and choose, right? Not be completely beholden to it. And so we picked a lot of our favorite things, like what we love about the time of day passage up at Stinson Beach, and the different colors you get, the different atmospheric qualities you get throughout the day, the different lighting quality. Like the midday lighting can be very sharp and very harsh and hot, versus like early in the morning, everything is soft and everything looks really, really beautiful. And this was great. Like, so we spent a whole day at the beach, just taking pictures at different time of day, and it's more or less the same set, the same angle, right? But it's got a completely different feel, right? It's very simplified as we go off into the distance. The atmosphere changes throughout the day, and it picks up the light and it scatters differently, and so you get a very different sensibility about what this world is at these different hours. And then we also knew that we wanted a very holistic world, right? And so we were inspired by Little Golden Books, because these things are pretty great, right? If you leaf through them, like they've all got a pretty unique and distinctive style in and of themselves, but they're really consistent, right? They build the rules of their world and then they totally stick with it all the way through. And like, we were actually like pretty inspired by that, right? And it's like, not that we wanted to copy any individual one, but we thought like, well, what if we, in our production artwork here, had a very consistent style, much like a Little Golden Book, then took real lights and real cameras into that space and shot a movie in there. Like, what would that be like? And so these were our targets. These were our early production paintings that, like, if we could hit all of these things, we felt like we'd be in a pretty good spot to make the film. And so then we broke the film up into 3 sections, 3 mini acts with each wave hit, right? And we picked just photos that we'd taken, an online reference and movie reference from the morning that we thought would be like the most beautiful, the most soft tones that we could find, and like what really moves us about this, right? Just to try and find a little bit of the visual language in broad strokes early without our own footage, up to like the midday stuff where it's hot and harsh, right? And like, what are our favorite movies that had that, our favorite photography and nature videos that really bring that feeling out. And then into the third part, like what feels like the end of the day, right? What do we see when we look out there that like you really get that the sun is just setting, you get this strong color contrast and this sort of beauty across the water. We tried to find these in kind of a collage method, right, that spoke to us and give us a lot of these subtleties in different ways. And then we took that and painted our own, right? We reinterpreted that with our own material and did the same thing, broke it up into 3 sections with, we did paintings for the morning, for the midday, and for the afternoon. And what that allowed us to do was start exploring our set and what our set needed to do to provide us this sort of thing. Like, how do we want things to cast shadows? You know, where do we want the light to shape in this world? Like, what's safety in the nest versus a very aggressive nest, right? Like, we used like the Snow White trick of using the shadows from the grass in the midday cut when we come back and the light's really harsh. It physically makes sense because the sun's out and it's bright, and I can use that as an emotional element to make Piper feel trapped. And then all the way through to, you know, the most perfect sunset you can imagine. Like, what would that mean? And what are our visual tent poles across the show to give us that?
Erik, who did this artwork?
I did the front half, and Jason Deemer, our production designer, did the back half. And you can tell because he's a character design artist, so all of his birds look like birds. Mine look like these blobs of color that kind of get the point across of what we needed to do, but like his you could frame. So it was cool. So once we had that, it gave us the ability to start like actually building out our film and what the cinematography in the film was going to mean. And it allowed me to start doing some of my favorite things. Like, once we had this sort of structure mapped out, like I always love revisiting a set with very different lighting and having a very different emotional response to it. And so what it gave us was like the morning in the nest to midday in the nest, right? And like, this is all the same set, right? And then just by using the lighting, we've established a very different language between these two things, and that's what makes my job fun, is these 2 frames right there. So then we experimented a lot with physical lights, right? Like, I don't know, like, how many of you are in CG in the audience here? Just a couple. Okay, that's great, right? So I don't have to worry about over-explaining this to all but 2 of you. There's like, what's popular these days are these image-based lights that you attach to domes, right? Which are based on texture, high dynamic range textures that you shoot at the sky, and it's all totally cool, right? Because like I talked a little bit earlier about authenticity, right? And we're trying to capture not reality, but something that felt really authentic. And with our simplified shading model, but a very realistic physically based lighting setup, it gives us a lot of cool things like the reflection in the character's eyes. You know, we can actually pull that from a backlit cloud that I use as my sun source, and it's wonderful. It gives you all this subtle detail. They're traditionally kind of hard to use in our medium. They're usually used more for architecture visualization because they don't have characters, right? And unfortunately, when your character pitches his head around, you may have to find like the perfect spot to get the gleam in the eye and all the shaping the way you want to. And so what we did is came up with a system where we split out the bright source from the IBL so we could rotate it independently. And this was really nothing too fancy other than a few hours in Photoshop carefully painting it out. But what it allowed me to do is, like you can see here, you can spin the lights around. We can capture Piper's perfect pose and the shaping we need for his face structure, regardless of where it was, without having to tip the whole sky up and upend the world. And then likewise, like this is all natural illumination. You know, one of somebody earlier asked about like technical innovations in the shorts. You know, one of the things that I was experimenting with here was like, how much could we work in a very physical framework, right? Kind of like I talked about, like getting inside a little golden book and shooting it as a real movie. And it was like, how much of this can we do without our traditional bag of CG cheats, right? Because we know we can do that, right? But they're hard and they're fragile, and as a filmmaking process, like it makes the scene much more rigid as far as like if animation needs to make a change, then we have to react to it, and you know, it's kind of tricky. And so we thought, what if we do this in just a very physical way, as if we were on the beach with this bird shooting it for real. And sometimes it doesn't work, right? Like this is a situation where he's just too dark, right? Like he's too nestled in the shadows there, and we don't have the read, we don't have the structure we need just from the sky illumination alone, no matter which way I rotate it and could spin it around. But we found that by adding a little bit of gaffing, right, like physical gaffing, again, this still exists in a space and it's still like we're on a beach, but as we stuck lights here and we stuck lights there to get a little bit of cool reflected light on his backside, a little bit of warm light, feels like it's motivated by the sun, even though it's coming from one of our own light sources. Here, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. It can still work in this physical framework as if we were actually on a digital live action set shooting this guy in a predictable way. And it's cool because what happened was, like, every now and then we need to slide things around because we got a certain composition that we want of like some of the sandhill crossing where his feet are, and it still works. We can just slide all the lights over. It's very malleable and very flexible. It also worked well because in animation, they're really primed to work with us, right? Because they want to know when a bird sticks his head out of a shadow into the light and back and be able to act to that performance. And so they need the feedback from lighting, and we want to be able to react to them. And so by working in this very broad stroked way, rather than with a bunch of sort of specific CGI lighting sheets, it allowed us to collaborate together, which is cool, right? Like both the lighting department and the animation department really enjoyed doing that, and frankly, I think made a better product for it, being able to hand things back and forth and bring it there.
What software are you using for this?
That you see up there? That's called Katana. It was originally made by Sony a number of years ago, and they sold it to the Foundry, the same people who make Nuke, and that's, for some people, the industry standard now. This is what we've been using for the past few shows, and we'll be using for the next few at least.
I think it was first used on Blue Umbrella, right?
Blue Umbrella was our first foray into it, yeah. Yep. And then Finding Dory was our first feature with it. And so, yeah, that's the end of my presentation. That's all I have. Thanks for coming out.